In last week's video, we took a look at how the Pentium MMX 166 performs with the Voodoo 2. I know that this CPU is underpowered for the Voodoo 2, but I wanted to see how it performed in a situation where you have the system with the Voodoo 1 and you upgrade it to a Voodoo 2. This was a viewer's request and I thought it was an interesting question. Now, results are kind of abstract because I didn't have a frame rate counter. So in this video, we're gonna dig a little deeper into this subject and we're gonna have side-by-side game captures with the Voodoo 2 and the Voodoo 1 with the frame rate counter, and we're gonna finally get to the bottom of this and see if it's worthwhile to upgrade your Pentium MMX 166 with a Voodoo 2. Here's a list to remember the differences between the cards, with the main difference being the SST2 chip on the Voodoo 2 being newer and more complex with 4 million transistors versus 1 million transistors in the SST1 used in the Voodoo 1. Now of course the Voodoo 2 is not in full use of its advantage due to the CPU being underpowered for it, but it wasn't an unthinkable upgrade at the time. This CPU is from early 1997 and the Voodoo 2 is from early 1998, so it would be undeniably an upgrade path. And actually this happened to me. Back in the 90s, I believe I ran my Voodoo 2 with an AMD K5 at first, not because I wanted or thought it was fitting, but because it was what I had. Although I'm absolutely sure it's not enough to compensate for the lack of power, the CPU does have a tiny overclock, which is the maximum this Socket 7 motherboard allows at 208 MHz. Since the 4 MB of the Voodoo 1 is a problem for some games at 800 by 600, all games will run at 640 by 480, and this means I can get direct captures. For some reason, the AverMedia game capture card enjoys 640 by 480, but not 800 by 600 with the Voodoo cards. Alright, now to begin with the test again to finally figure out if you gain anything by upgrading from a Voodoo 1 to a Voodoo 2 on a Pentium MMX 166. First game we have here is Half-Life. For this whole batch of runs, we're going to have the Voodoo 1 on the left and the Voodoo 2 on the right. For most of these, it's still a bit subjective because it's difficult to get the exact same images during gameplay, but you can pause at moments you find more similar and look at the FPS. So in Half-Life, even though I messed up and used different weapons in the beginning of the run, that should make little to no difference, and to my eyes, there's mostly no gain at all going from the Voodoo 1 to the Voodoo 2 with this CPU. Unreal is a game that scales very well with SLI technology, like when you use a Voodoo 5, but of course you have to give it a fast enough CPU, not the case in our experiment here with the Voodoo 2 and the Pentium MMX 166. Much like Half-Life 1, to my eyes, there's little to no improvement when doing the upgrade from the Voodoo 1 to the Voodoo 2 for the game Unreal. Results on Shogo are much like the other games, no visible advantage on frame rates, but I promise the results of the next game will surprise you. I love looking at this game in third person. Unfortunately, they didn't do a very good job with the camera and there's no reticle for shooting in third person, so it's just a cool gimmick. You can't really fight in third person in Shogo. For some reason, the gamma on the image of only this game is 2 or 3 points higher on the Voodoo 2. I'll try to fix that in post. Tell me if you see the difference. Alright, now for the results I promised you. In Quake 2, you get a huge performance bonus with the Voodoo 2 versus the Voodoo 1. Unfortunately, this is pretty much the only game I found that would give you a good return for investment in a Voodoo 2 back in 1998 if you had a Pentium MMX 166. Nevertheless, it's an astounding difference with the Voodoo 2 giving you twice the performance of the Voodoo 1, even with the completely underpowered CPU. Expandable is a cool test to do side by side because you can see the Voodoo 2 slowly gaining on the Voodoo 1 to the point when I synchronize them back up and watch the Voodoo 2 start gaining ground again. Although the V2 is clearly faster, the margins are really small. I know that this is due to the CPU being too slow for the Voodoo 2, but go ahead and remind me again on the comment section. I'd love to hear what you think. In 3D Mark 99, things start getting a bit interesting. There are a few tests that the V1 doesn't run for lack of functionality, but believe it or not, there are some tests that the Voodoo 1 scores better than the Voodoo 2. This is probably due to the CPU holding the Voodoo 2 back, yes I know, but also there are some tests where the Voodoo 2 does much better than the Voodoo 1. I'll quickly pass through the tests and you can pause the video if you want to take a deeper look into them. I hope that we finally objectively answered this question, and if you enjoy GPU battles like the one you saw in this video, why don't you watch this other one that featured the battle between the Voodoo 4 and the Voodoo 5.